Okay, let's talk about one of the greatest business transactions in human history. It's a transaction or a series of transactions between, at the time, the most powerful corporate empire to ever exist and a 40-person startup. These are the two transacting parties. Which one do you think would have gotten the upper hand? If the gigantic corporate empire would have got the upper hand, I wouldn't be telling the story right now. Because this story, apart from being one of the greatest transactions in history and making one of these parties some of the richest people in the world, it's a tale of misunderstanding the business that you're in, and also falling in love with the way that you made money and how that romanticism can lead to your downfall. So I'm going to do two videos on this because there's two parts to this fiasco, and both of them represent two different times these two companies collaborated. So the first part of this transaction takes place in the early 1980s, when that aforementioned greatest corporate empire of all time, a company called IBM, still around, still making billions of dollars a year, but nobody that's around today that knows the modern IBM has any clue on what IBM meant in the 20th century. It was quite literally all of the technology companies today that dominate the S&P 500 rolled up into one, because they were the only player in town. They were the first global computing business that achieved unprecedented scale, network effects, switching costs. They innovated. They did deals with everybody. They were incredible. They were, at one point, some insane percentage of the S&P 500 in the way that today NVIDIA is or Apple was. So it's hard to overstate the position IBM was in. They are the powerhouse in computing, the most valuable company in the world, and they were about to enter a new market. That market was personal computers. For those of you that don't know, computers were not made for personal use until the late 70s. Before that, and what comprised of IBM's entire business is selling computation systems to businesses. Because as far as the world thought, why the hell would an individual need computation services? Computation is higher order mathematics and bookkeeping and payroll and inventory management and things that regular people don't have to do, only large enterprises have to do. And IBM built their entire business off of that. The name IBM stands for International Business Machines. So they made a killing in that industry. They missed an industry, which is something, a little weird part of the history of technology called microcomputers, which is really not a business mainframe, but not a personal computer. That was dominated by a company called DEC Instruments, I believe. But anyway, that was really niche. It was very small. It was like basically a non-business machine. It's still very big, very clunky, very unusable by regular people. But in the late 70s, would you have it, the emergence of the personal computer. Companies like Apple, Altair, all these different companies that kind of propelled the first versions of personal computing. Today, if you looked at any of these original computers, you wouldn't be able to make them out to even be a computer, but they were fundamentally an innovation. They were something that people could use at home. They were still far away from graphical user interfaces and things that we take for granted today, but they were computers nonetheless, and they were somewhat affordable. And so by the early 1980s, tens of thousands of units of these personal computers had been shipped. Now, that's a drop in the pan for IBM, but IBM was adamant that they were not going to miss the personal computing revolution. So they called all their executives together in some island, Bahamas or somewhere, and they put together something called Project Chess. Project Chess basically said to the team that was going to run Project Chess, the executives of IBM said, you have 1 year to ship a personal computer. This is a virtually impossible task. To go from not making a personal computer, regardless of all the resources IBM had, to being able to assemble the hardware, the software, the distribution in a nascent industry, really in 1 year from the time they heard about it. So anyway, they issued the order and the executives and the team get to work. And IBM, being IBM, was able to really flourish and succeed on the hardware side of things because they were world class at assembling hardware, at manufacturing hardware, at designing hardware. All three elements that you needed to build a personal computer. But when it came to the software, this is a new industry for anybody. There's no concept really of a software company, even in this time. And so IBM said, we're going to outsource this, which is made perfect sense because the money, as IBM would dreadfully find out, but they thought at this time, everybody thought the money was in hardware. DEC made its money in hardware. IBM made fortunes in hardware. Apple was selling hardware. The Altair was hardware. Why wouldn't it be hardware? And we are the biggest hardware player in the world, and we got a lock on this. So the software, who cares what runs on this machine? So they approach, you need a couple of things to run a computer at this time. You need an operating system, and this not like what you think of today as Windows or Mac. It's a operating system is such a lavish way of saying what this was. But you need an operating system nonetheless, and you need something called a basic interpreter, which allows the computer to be able to read the programs. So the company that had an interesting lead in the basic interpreter market was this 40-person startup based originally in Albuquerque and then later moved to Seattle. You may know this company. You definitely know them today, but you may have already picked up who this company is. It's Microsoft. 40 people, Bill Gates and Paul Allen still running the show, just brought on Steve Ballmer, and IBM comes knocking. Because because Microsoft had been the dominant distributor of their basic interpreter. That was Microsoft's first product and only product at the time. A basic interpreter for personal computers. They had sold it to Apple. They had made it for the Altair. They had made it for anyone in the market. And so that's how they were surviving. They were basically cutting these deals where they would sell access to their basic interpreter to OEM manufacturers. To give you an example, Microsoft had earlier in that season delivered the basic interpreter for Apple for $31,000 flat. So that's cool, and that's fine, and that's their business. And they're a small startup, but starting to grow, and IBM comes knocking. Now, just this notion that IBM would approach a startup is ludicrous. Mistake number one. Obviously, in hindsight, we have 20/20 vision, but this is already ludicrous. But nonetheless, they do it. Bill Gates says, whoa, not verbatim, but he says, wow, this is going to be the biggest deal in the history of Microsoft. We're going to get our basic interpreter in the hands of every IBM personal computer. And he knew immediately that when IBM entered the personal computing market, they are going to blow it out of the water. Whatever was sold last year in total units is just going to be a drop in the pond compared to what IBM is capable and will do. So he was super excited. He said, of course, yes, we'll definitely give you our basic interpreter. It's going to be great. It's going to be the best in the world. It's going to be great. IBM also said, that's great. We'll do it. Congratulations. But we also need an operating system. Bill, for all of the other customers that he had sold the basic interpreter to, recommended a company to go get to provide the operating system. And it's a company that nobody knows anymore. It's called Digital Research Inc. For the rest of this, I'm going to call that company DRI because that's what they're colloquially known by. It was founded by Gary Kildall, who's a kind of a legendary computer scientist. He wrote this operating system, which is called CP/M, and it was the industry standard. He was already making a lot of money selling this operating system, CP/M, to OEM manufacturers, and he had done different deals, and he was charging royalties on every unit sold. What we later accredit as a brilliant Bill Gates idea, Gary Kildall was doing first. And Gary Kildall had the best operating system in the game. And Bill Gates and him had a good relationship. So he said to IBM, you know what? Go get it from him. He has the best version you're going to get. So one fateful day in the early 1980s, a bunch of IBM executives fly to go meet Gary Kildall. Now, the way the story is told is it's almost like they show up out of nowhere. Now, I can't imagine that to be true, but it is the 1980s, before kind of modern communications, and definitely before the computer and the internet. And it's much more fun to think of the way, because people have had so many different variations of the story, because literally what happens at this meeting changes the future of the world and the future of all of these companies' fortunes. So what happens is IBM executives show up at headquarters and they're like, we're here to see Gary. We want to buy an operating system, which literally is Santa Claus coming and saying, hey, how much money do you want to make? Because we're about to distribute your product to the whole world. It so happens that Gary is not there. This is why I think he didn't know they were coming. There was no way he would miss this meeting. This is one version of the story, is that he was away from the office. He was allegedly on a private plane or meeting some other person. And so the IBM executives meet with Gary's wife. And Gary's wife, didn't want to sign the NDA. The IBM's NDA, you can only imagine, is probably a Harry Potter book. Like they don't want anyone knowing this is happening. So Gary's wife denied signing the NDA, which already perturbed the IBM executives. Secondly, some other version of the story says that no, Gary did negotiate with the IBM executives, but they couldn't come to terms because IBM wanted to pay a fixed fee, some say $200,000, and wanted to give Gary a small royalty on every unit sold. Or maybe, and some stories even say they wanted to give no royalty. Gary said, yeah, no thank you. We're already making millions of dollars selling our best-in-class operating system to your competitors, and we're making a bigger royalty than you're willing to give us on every machine, so no thank you. That's one version of the story. The other version of the story is that he wasn't even there. IBM executives, pissed, go back to Bill Gates and say, WTF, like, why did you recommend us to this person? He wasn't even there. Or he's being stubborn and he doesn't want to do a deal. Does he not know that he's talking to IBM? Bill Gates says, oh my goodness. Now this next part of the story is even more controversial and shadowed and covered in mystery because it's like epic lore in the technology industry. Bill Gates turns around to IBM and says, and Bill Gates says, well, that sounds like a you problem. I still have my basic. I'm ready to go. And what IBM said is, no, you got to figure out the operating system, allegedly. You got to figure out, tell us where to get it, or you figure it out yourself. And Bill Gates, not wanting to lose this lucrative deal for his basic interpreter, says, okay, yeah, I'll figure this out. And it's not known whether Bill Gates fully understood the magnitude of what he was about to do. The fact that he's probably one of the smartest people who ever lived, in my opinion, makes me believe he did know what he was about to do. But nonetheless, by the way, we're talking about somebody in their 20s at this point. But nonetheless, he goes and he says to IBM, yeah, I got you. I'm going to give you the operating system. Microsoft had no capacity to build an operating system, and definitely not within the time frame that IBM needed it. So you know what he does? He goes to a person in Seattle, Tim Patterson, who is running a company called Seattle Computer Products. And for some reason, Tim Patterson had a clone, like a version, a competitor, a counter to CP/M, which was the industry leader created by DRI. And Tim had created this operating system called QDOS, which stood for Quick and Dirty Operating System, which is like a mimic of CP/M. Bill Gates said, wow, great, fabulous. You know what? We're going to buy it from you. Allegedly, he bought it for $50,000, proper deal, paid the man. Everybody was happy. Nothing happened under duress. This is the story as it goes, still shrouded in mystery. Bill Gates turns around, renames QDOS, because Quick and Dirty Operating System is probably not going to fly with IBM anyway, and renames it to MS-DOS, Microsoft Disk Operating System. Delivers it to IBM. They're like, fabulous, you've solved our problem. We're going to hit our target of launching within a year, which is so crazy that actually they basically pulled it off. And now comes the negotiation. Now comes the first of the two greatest deals in business history. Bill Gates negotiates a total software delivery implementation for IBM for both the basic interpreter and MS-DOS for a total of $430,000. And this was like inclusive of a 3-year delivery, and it was a bunch of one-time fixed work that Microsoft was going to do for the development and the delivery of these two critical factors to the IBM PC. And notingly, he did not negotiate any royalties, $0 on every unit sold. When I was growing up, I had always just heard and thought that Bill Gates' greatest business accomplishment was that he did negotiate something with IBM that made him be able to make money from every IBM PC. It was actually not true. The deal fell apart with Gary because he tried to negotiate that. Bill Gates said, no, you don't have to pay us on any model sold. You just have to pay us up front for this, which is a write-off for both IBM and for Microsoft. It was pretty cool, right? They turned 50,000 into 4, but that's nothing compared to what's about to happen. Compared to the tsunami that's about to happen is nothing. So IBM agreed, but Bill Gates had one condition. And this is a famous, studied in business schools ever since condition, which is that this is a non-exclusive deal, and Microsoft reserved the rights to the entire MS-DOS and basic interpreter, so it's still owned by Microsoft, and they had the right to sell it to anyone else at any price. So they were giving it to IBM for free, basically, for free. IBM went ahead, launched the IBM PC. It was a resounding success, immediately became the number one player in the market, sold tons of units, and paid Microsoft nothing on every unit sold. So if you were the IBM executives post-launch of Project Chess, you would have thought you just walked on water. A year ago, you were not in the personal computing market and it looked like you were going to let another big market slip away. 1 year later, you had created from scratch the entire hardware, somehow finessed the software, launched the product. It's a resounding success. Everybody loves it. It becomes the number one PC in the world immediately. And you got the better of this kid in his 20s who was dumb enough to sign this away without a royalty. And that's what they must have been thinking. And this is not how history turned out. Microsoft, and particularly Bill Gates, understood something. He understood that if he was able to get MS-DOS as the default operating system in every IBM PC sold, that would become the fulcrum that developers all around the world would now build programs for. Because why would you not build programs for the biggest distributive pipeline, which is the IBM PC? And as soon as they built programs for MS-DOS, now the value shifted. The value was created by the distribution capacity of IBM, but it shifts the moment that the developer community starts to write applications for MS-DOS, and now it's captured. The fulcrum no longer becomes IBM's computer, but the fulcrum of this value chain becomes Microsoft's operating system. And you can utilize IBM to become the number one player and therefore the fulcrum that everybody wants to build for and that everybody as a customer wants to buy and use. And remember, because IBM thinks they got the better of you and because they have other people that are willing to sell them operating systems, but they got to pay for it, IBM would push the hell out of Microsoft's system because they make 100% profit. They actually sold it as an add-on and kept all the money. And now what would happen is the second, third, fourth to infinity hardware manufacturer that is going to come and compete with IBM is all going to require MS-DOS because that's the one that now has captured the value chain of both the program developers as well as the customers. And because he negotiated the ability to resell it to them, those guys would come and say, wait, what do you want for this? This is now the de facto, we're just going to use it, and we're going to compete with IBM on the hardware. So he had many great insights here, but one of them was that hardware is commodity. It's incredible that he understood this. Because until now, hardware was not a commodity. It was the thing. It was the thing that captured all the value. Okay? Bill Gates was building the world's first real software company. So he realized, I don't know how he realized this, but he realized the value, the hardware providers are just going to compete the profits to zero. It's like what Peter Thiel says, never be in an industry where the profits are going to get competed away. Within 1 year of IBM's personal computer launching, a company is formed in called Compaq, which later became another juggernaut. In the first year, did $100 million in sales, building a cheaper version of the IBM computer, running MS-DOS. And then, of course, today, you have Dell, and you have HP, and you have Lenovo. The list goes on. Nobody cares about the OEM manufacturers. They competed the profit away. And Microsoft used the linchpin of that deal to be able to then charge every subsequent PC manufacturer per unit. It's a masterclass. It made Bill Gates the richest man in the world. It made Microsoft one of the most valuable companies of all time. It created the software industry as we know it today, where a company writes software, retains the ownership, and licenses it out today, which then would, of course, set the basis for the SaaS revolution and now AI. Unbelievable. But more than anything, it's a tale of hubris, and it's a tale of misunderstanding where the value lies in a transaction. And more importantly, it's a cautionary tale against falling in love with the way that you made money.